Clara was 19 years old the day her life was traded for a stack of ledgers and the forgiveness of a debt. The man who bought her, Abel, was old enough to be her father, with a face carved from the same hard rock and unforgiving sun as the land he owned. Her own father, a man broken by drought and poor investments, couldn't meet her eyes as he shook Abel's hand. The deal was done. Clara, with her soft hands and quiet dreams of a life far from the dust-choked plains, was the final payment. The wedding was a bleak affair, held not in a church but in the dusty yard of the territorial office. A hot, persistent wind whipped Clara's thin veil across her face and stole the preacher's words before they could settle. The few attendees were Abel's neighbors, ranchers with skin like tanned leather and eyes that held no warmth. They watched the proceedings with the same detached interest they'd give a livestock auction. There were no joyful tears, no heartfelt blessings. There was only the grit of sand between Clara's teeth and the heavy weight of the gold band Abel forced onto her finger. It felt less like a ring and more like a manacle. The journey to her new home was a long, silent passage into desolation. Abel's ranch was nestled deep in a valley of stone teeth, a place the sun seemed to punish rather than bless. They traveled for hours in a buckboard wagon, the rhythmic creak of the wheels the only sound between them. Clara looked out at the landscape, a panorama of failure and exhaustion. The grass was the color of old bones, brittle and dead. Sharp-edged hills clawed at a sky so vast and empty it seemed to swallow all hope. This was not a place where things grew. It was a place where things endured, or were broken. The ranch house stood as a testament to that endurance. It was a two-story structure of dark, weathered wood, built for function, not comfort. It had the look of a fortress against the wilderness, not a home within it. Abel reined in the horses and simply sat there, his gaze sweeping over his domain. He didn't offer Clara a hand as she climbed down, her legs stiff and trembling. "Martha will show you the house," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough as gravel. "Your duties are simple. You will keep it clean. You will have meals ready. You will not be idle." He didn't look at her as he spoke, his attention already on the corrals. Inside, the house was as stark and joyless as the land outside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, soap, and a faint, lingering sorrow. A stout, gray-haired woman named Martha, the cook and housekeeper, gave Clara a curt nod. Her eyes, small and dark, held a flicker of pity that was almost worse than the indifference of the wedding guests. She led Clara through the rooms, her explanations clipped and impersonal. The kitchen, the parlor with its heavy, uninviting furniture, and finally, the upstairs bedroom. It was large and clean, dominated by a massive four-poster bed. A single window looked out onto the endless expanse of scorched earth and rock. It felt like a cell. Abel was a widower, a fact he never spoke of but which hung in the house like a permanent chill. He treated Clara not as a wife, but as a new piece of property, one he was still assessing the value of. He ate his meals in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate. He slept in the same bed with her, but kept a rigid distance, his back a wall of muscle and resentment between them. He made it clear, in 1,000 unspoken ways, that she was merely a placeholder, a warm body to manage his house, a living symbol of a debt paid. He saw her as a transaction, and transactions required no affection. Her life became a cycle of hollow duties, mending Abel's coarse work shirts, sweeping dust that immediately returned, and staring out her window at the unblinking sun. The loneliness was a physical presence, a weight that settled on her chest and made it hard to breathe. Weeks bled into a month, each day a mirror of the last. The landscape never changed. The wind never stopped its mournful sighing around the corners of the house. The sun rose, scorched the earth, and set, leaving behind a cold, star-filled darkness that offered no comfort. Clara felt herself fading, the colors of her spirit draining away until she was as gray and muted as the dust that covered everything. Then, one afternoon, the crushing monotony was broken. A rider appeared on the horizon, not approaching with the steady gait of a neighbor, but swaying dangerously in the saddle. As he drew closer, Clara could see his horse was lathered in sweat, its steps faltering. The man slumped forward, a dead weight held in place only by sheer will. Abel, who was mending a fence near the barn, straightened up, his eyes narrowed. He strode toward the approaching rider, his movements economical and wary. Clara watched from the porch, her hand flying to her throat. The horse finally stopped, its sides heaving, and the man slid from the saddle, collapsing in a heap in the dust. Abel knelt beside him, turning him over with a roughness born of impatience. From the porch, Clara couldn't see the man's face, only that his clothes were torn and stained with blood. Abel was still for a long moment before letting out a grunt of what sounded like frustrated recognition. He stood and yelled for two of his ranch hands. "Take him to the old stables. See if Martha can patch him up. Don't bring him in the house." The ranch hands carried the injured man away, his limbs dangling limply. Curiosity, a feeling Clara hadn't experienced in months, pricked at her. Later that evening, after she had served Abel his silent dinner, she found Martha in the kitchen, cleaning a bowl stained with blood. "Is he?" Clara began, her voice barely a whisper. Martha didn't look up. "He'll live. Took a bullet in the shoulder, looks like, and got beat up for good measure." "Who is he?" Martha finally paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Name's Eli, Mr. Abel knew his commanding officer in the war, says he owes the man a debt. Seems this is how it's being paid." She gestured with her chin toward the window. "Mr. Abel said he can work for his keep once he's on his feet. He'll be staying in the old stable out back." The news settled uneasily in Clara's stomach. A stranger, a violent man, by the sounds of it, now living just a stone's throw from the house. The next day, she saw him. She was drawing water from the well when the stable door creaked open. He moved slowly, his arm in a crude sling, his body stiff with pain. He stepped into the harsh sunlight, and Clara felt a sharp intake of breath. He was younger than she expected, perhaps only by a few years, but it was his face that held her captive. A terrible scar, old and white, ran from the corner of his left eye down across his cheek, disappearing into the scruff of his jaw. It was a jagged line of raised, puckered flesh, a map of some past violence that was far more permanent than the fresh wounds he carried. He seemed to feel her gaze, and his head turned. His eyes met hers for only a second. They were a deep, startling blue, but filled with a hollowed-out sadness that seemed to echo the desolation of the land around them. There was no threat in them, only a profound weariness. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and retreated back into the shadows of the stable. Clara stood frozen by the well, the bucket forgotten in her hand. A shiver, completely unrelated to the heat, ran down her spine. The man, Eli, was terrifying. The scar spoke of a life steeped in brutality, a world she couldn't begin to imagine. A part of her wanted to run inside, bolt the door, and never look toward the stables again. But another part, a small, neglected corner of her heart, felt a strange and unwelcome stirring. It was not fear, not exactly. It was a flicker of empathy. In the profound silence of his gaze, in the quiet way he carried his pain, she recognized a fellow prisoner. His cage was made of memory and violence, hers of duty and loneliness. And in the oppressive silence of that desolate ranch, she felt the first faint stirrings of a terrible, tender curiosity. True to Martha's prediction, Eli healed. Within a week, the sling was gone, and he moved about the ranch with a quiet, relentless energy that stood in stark contrast to his stillness. He was a phantom worker. Before the sun had fully risen, the water troughs would be filled. Fences that had been sagging for months were suddenly taut and strong. He worked with a silent competence that Abel seemed to respect, for he left the man to his tasks. the old debt apparently creating a space of autonomy around Eli. He never sought Clara out. In fact, he seemed to make a concerted effort to remain at the edges of her world. If she was in the yard shaking out a rug, he would be at the far end of the corral. If she was tending her small, struggling herb garden, he would be mending tack in the barn. Yet the vast empty space of the ranch suddenly felt smaller, charged with his presence, and in this shared space, a silent language began to form. One morning, she struggled to carry 2 heavy buckets of water from the well. Her arms ached, and she had to set them down halfway to the kitchen. She went inside for only a moment to catch her breath, and when she returned, the buckets were sitting right beside the kitchen door. She scanned the yard, but Eli was nowhere to be seen, only the faint impression of his boots in the dust. Another day. A sudden gust of wind tore a freshly washed sheet from her hands as she was hanging the laundry. It billowed across the yard, heading for a muddy patch near the trough. Before she could even cry out in frustration, a dark shape moved with surprising speed. Eli's foot pinned a corner of the sheet to the dry ground, saving it. He bent, picked it up, and held it out to her. Their hands brushed as she took it. It was the briefest of contacts, his skin calloused and warm against hers. But a jolt, sharp and startling, shot up her arm. Her eyes flew to his. For a split second, the weary sadness in his gaze was replaced by something else. Surprise, perhaps, and a flicker of awareness that mirrored her own. Then it was gone. He pulled his hand back as if burned, gave a curt nod, and walked away without a word, leaving Clara with a wildly hammering heart and the clean, earthy scent of him on her skin. She began to watch him from the safety of her bedroom window. It became a secret ritual, a crack in the suffocating wall of her loneliness. She saw the methodical way he worked, the patience he had with the horses, speaking to them in low murmurs she could never quite hear. His movements were spare and efficient, yet held an undercurrent of deep-seated pain. Her most private observation came at dusk, most evenings. He would take a bar of soap and a towel and walk toward the small, willow-choked creek that snaked through the far edge of Abel's property. From her window, she could just make out his silhouette against the fading orange light. He would strip off his shirt, and the sight always made her breath catch. His back and shoulders were a roadmap of healed injuries, a tapestry of white lines that crisscrossed his sun-darkened skin. They were different from the jagged scar on his face. These were the marks of whips, knives, and things she could not begin to name. She would watch as he waded into the cool water, the setting sun glinting off the terrible, beautiful landscape of his body. A profound, aching pity mingled with a fearful curiosity. Who was this man, who had survived so much only to end up in this desolate corner of the world? While this silent connection with Eli grew, the chasm between Clara and her husband widened into an impassable canyon. Abel retreated further into his own bitter world. He spent his evenings staring into the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight in the room. Most nights, he would climb the stairs and fall into bed, turning his back to her before she'd even had a chance to extinguish the lamp. His loud snores a final, definitive wall between them. One night, unable to sleep, Clara crept downstairs for a glass of water. She stopped at the bottom of the staircase, hidden in the shadows. Abel was hunched before the hearth, but he wasn't drinking. He was holding a small, silver-framed photograph in the flickering firelight. She could just make out the image of a woman with a gentle smile, his first wife. Clara watched, frozen, as Abel's thumb stroked the glass once, a gesture of agonizing tenderness that he had never once shown her. Then, his face hardened into a mask of grief and rage. With a sudden, violent motion, he tossed the entire frame into the heart of the fire. The silver tarnished, the glass cracked, and the smiling woman's face curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. He watched it burn, his shoulders slumped, a man immolating his own past. In that moment, Clara understood. She was not a wife. She was a ghost living in another woman's house, and her husband was the one who was truly haunted. A new resolve hardened in her. She could not mend Abel's broken heart, but perhaps she could offer a small comfort to the other lost soul on this ranch. The next evening, after Abel had retired to his room, Clara wrapped 2 pieces of leftover cornbread in a napkin. Her hands trembled as she lit a small lantern and slipped out the back door. The air was cool, the sky littered with stars. The sound of her own footsteps seemed deafening in the stillness. The stable was dark, save for a sliver of light from Eli's own lantern. He was sitting on a hay bale, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone stopped the moment she appeared in the doorway. He looked up, his eyes wary in the dim light. I thought you might be hungry," she stammered, holding out the bundle. "Martha doesn't always leave much out." He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly wiped his hands on his trousers, stood, and took the offering. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed against hers again. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "Clara," she corrected softly. "My name is Clara." He gave a slight nod. "Eli." She lingered, unsure of what else to say. Is it better?" "It's mending." The conversation died. The air was thick with unspoken things. Finally. She gave a nervous smile and retreated back to the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did it again the next night, and the night after that. Sometimes she brought bread, sometimes a piece of leftover pie. Their conversations were never long. She would ask about the horses, he would give a one-sentence reply. But each night, the wariness in his eyes lessened, replaced by a quiet watchfulness, a flicker of warmth that was more nourishing than any food she could bring him. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the north, a great bruised wall of cloud that swallowed the sky. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain began to fall in thick, driving sheets. Inside the house, Clara listened to the storm's fury, the sound of it drumming against the roof. Her thoughts were not on her own comfort, but on the man in the old, drafty stable. Clutching a heavy wool blanket to her chest, she braved the storm. The wind tore at her dress and the rain soaked her hair in seconds, but she pushed on, her lantern casting a weak, dancing light. She found the stable door hanging open, swinging wildly on its hinges. Inside, the wind and rain had invaded. Water dripped steadily from a dozen places in the old roof. Eli was trying to move a saddle and other leather goods to a dry corner, his shirt already damp. He turned as she entered, his eyes wide with surprise. "The roof is leaking," she said, stating the obvious, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the storm. She held out the blanket. "I thought you might be cold." He stopped what he was doing and just looked at her, standing there dripping and shivering, holding the dry blanket out for him. He slowly walked over and took it, his gaze searching her face. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said, his voice filled with a rough concern that made her stomach flutter. "Neither should you," she replied, gesturing at a particularly bad leak. They stood in silence for a moment, the storm raging around them creating a strange, intimate bubble of quiet. He draped the blanket over a dry hay bale and motioned for her to sit. He sat a respectful distance away. "I've slept in worse," he finally said, his eyes on the rain. "In the war?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. His posture stiffened. He didn't answer for a long time. "Among other places," he said at last, his voice flat. He turned his head to look at her, and in the lantern light, his scar seemed to deepen. "The war, it teaches you how to endure. It doesn't teach you how to live after." As he spoke, he shifted, and the damp fabric of his shirt pulled taut against his chest, revealing the faint outline of another scar, long and straight, just below his collarbone. Her eyes fixed on it, it looked different, more deliberate than the chaotic marks on his back. He noticed her gaze and looked down, a shadow passing over his face. He didn't try to hide it. "I lived," he said softly, the words barely audible over the rain. "Others didn't." The simple statement hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was not an explanation or a boast. It was a confession, the sound of a man haunted by the simple, arbitrary fact of his own survival. She saw it then, the true source of the sadness in his eyes. It was not just weariness. It was guilt. Clara lay awake for hours that night, long after the storm had passed, the moonlight now streaming through her window. The sound of Abel's oblivious snoring filled the room, but all she could hear were Eli's words, echoing in the silence of her heart. "I lived, others didn't." The phrase became a key, unlocking a deeper understanding of the scarred, silent man in her husband's stable. He was not just a survivor. He was a ghost, just like her, haunted by a life that was and a life that wasn't, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she would go back to the stables again. The rare trips into the nearest town, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings called Redemption, were a source of acute misery for Clara. She would ride beside Abel, a silent figure in her best gray dress, feeling the eyes of the townsfolk on her. They did not look at her with the warmth reserved for a neighbor, nor the simple respect for the wife of a powerful rancher. Their gazes were filled with a dissecting curiosity, their whispers following her like the dust devils that danced down the main street. "There's Abel's new wife," she'd hear them murmur behind their hands at the general store. "Pretty thing, ain't she? Looks like a porcelain doll on a shelf full of iron pots." One woman, the blacksmith's wife, had looked at her with an expression of profound pity. "More like a canary in a cage," she had said to her companion, not quite softly enough. The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow because they were true. She was a bird in a cage, and her gilded prison was Abel's sprawling, desolate ranch. She was fed and housed, but her wings had been clipped, and she had forgotten the sound of her own song. That evening, the remark still stinging, she found herself lingering in the kitchen as Martha kneaded dough for the next day's bread. The housekeeper was a woman of few words, but her presence was solid and real in a way that nothing else in Clara's life was. "They talk about me in town," Clara said, her voice small. "They look at me like I'm something pitiable." Martha continued her work, her strong hands punching and turning the dough with methodical force. "Folks in a town like this have little to do but watch their neighbor's business. They see a young wife and an old husband, and they draw their own conclusions." A surge of desperate honesty rose in Clara, a need to make at least one person understand the full, barren truth of her existence. "It's not a marriage, Martha," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It was a business arrangement, a debt paid." She took a shaky breath. He doesn't come near me. He has never touched me as a husband would." The kneading stopped. For the first time, Martha turned to look at Clara fully, her dark eyes losing their customary guardedness. There was no shock in them, only a deep, weary understanding. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and gestured to a small stool. "I know, child," she said, her voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "I was here when his first wife, Eleanor, was alive. He loved her something fierce. When he lost her to the fever, something inside him died, too. What he did, bringing you here, it wasn't about finding a new wife. It was about filling an empty house. He bought a caretaker, not a companion." The confirmation, spoken aloud, was both a relief and a final, crushing sentence. There was no hope of warmth, no chance of affection ever growing in this cold, hard soil. Her marriage was a sham, her life a lie. Martha's quiet sympathy was a small comfort, but it also solidified the walls of her prison. The next morning, Clara rose with a heart as heavy as lead. She was listlessly shaking a tablecloth out on the porch when a sight from the corral seized her attention. Eli was there, his back to her, repairing a broken saddle he had set upon a wooden stand. He was shirtless in the growing heat of the day, his skin tanned a deep bronze by the relentless sun. The morning light caught the intricate web of scars on his back, turning them into a silvery relief map of pain. She watched, mesmerized, as the powerful muscles in his shoulders and back shifted with each movement, each pull of the awl through thick leather. He worked with a quiet, focused grace, his body a testament to both brutal hardship and incredible resilience. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a painful, unfamiliar thrumming. It was a feeling so potent it frightened her. She quickly retreated inside, but the image of him, solitary, scarred, and strong, was burned into her mind. That night, she didn't take any food. Her visit to the stables was no longer something she could disguise with a thin pretext of charity. It was a need, a pull as undeniable as gravity. She slipped out of the house and found him sitting on the same hay bale as always, staring into the darkness beyond the stable door. He looked up as she approached, his eyes questioning her empty hands. She said nothing, simply went and sat on a small crate a few feet from him. For a long time, they just existed in the shared space, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of a horse in its stall. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a peaceful one, a respite from the loud, demanding emptiness of the rest of her life. "The quiet feels different out here," she said finally, her voice soft. He turned his head slightly. "How so?" "In the house, the quiet is empty. It's a lack of sound. Out here, it's full of living things." He considered this for a moment. "I suppose it is." He looked away again, but a door had been opened. After another long pause, he spoke again, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "I had a sister once, younger than me. Her name was Sarah." He stared at his hands as he spoke, as if the story were written in his palms. "After the war, things were bad. There wasn't enough food, not enough work. Our folks were gone. I tried, I hunted, I took any job I could find, but I was just a boy myself." He fell silent, and Clara held her breath, knowing this was a sacred, painful place he was allowing her to enter. "She was so small," he continued, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. "She'd try to hide it, pretend she wasn't hungry. She'd give me her share of whatever little I brought home. One day she just didn't wake up, faded away from hunger while I was out trying to find work." A single, hot tear escaped Clara's eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The story was so simple, so brutal. It felt like a shard of glass in her own heart. She saw it all: the desperate boy, the fading girl, the terrible, quiet finality of it, without thinking, without considering the impropriety of it. She moved from the crate and knelt in the straw beside him. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against his chest, right over his heart. It was a gesture of pure, unadorned empathy, a silent offering of shared sorrow. He flinched at her touch, his whole body going rigid, but he did not push her away. Instead, after a heart-stopping moment, he slowly raised his own hand and covered hers, his calloused fingers gently enveloping her own. His skin was warm, and beneath her palm, she could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart. They said nothing more. They didn't need to. They simply stayed there as a light rain began to fall outside. The soft drumming on the roof, a gentle rhythm accompanying the frantic beating of their two lonely hearts. The next night, she returned. She carried a small bowl of warm water and a clean cloth, telling herself it was for the old ache in his shoulder, the one that sometimes made him wince when he lifted something heavy. It was an excuse, and she knew he would see it for what it was, a reason to be near him, a reason to touch him again. He was waiting, as if he knew she would come. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. She knelt before him as she had the night before. "For your shoulder," she whispered, her voice unsteady. He gave a slow nod, his gaze never leaving her face. He unbuttoned the top of his shirt, exposing the skin of his collarbone and the top of the long, straight scar that lay beneath it. Her hand trembled as she dipped the cloth in the warm water and reached for him. Her fingers brushed against the raised, smooth line of the scar. It was a strange texture, skin that remembered a deep wound. The touch was electric, a current that seemed to flow from him directly into her soul. He drew a sharp breath. His eyes, so often distant and haunted, were now fixed on hers with a burning intensity. They were so close she could see the flecks of gold in his blue irises, feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. The world narrowed to the small, golden circle of the lantern light, to the space between their two faces. All the rules, all the reasons she shouldn't be here, faded into nothing. "I don't know why I want to come here," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a raw, honest whisper. "I only know that on the days I don't see you, I feel empty. The house feels empty. Everything is empty." Her confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, dangerous, and beautiful thing. It was everything she had been holding inside, a declaration not of love, but of need. And in the dim, quiet light of the stable, it felt like the most honest thing she had ever said. Their nightly meetings in the stable became a fragile sanctuary. The rest of the world, with its harsh sun, silent dinners, and judgmental eyes, ceased to exist within the small circle of their lantern light. They talked for hours, their voices low and soft, weaving a tapestry of trust in the darkness. He spoke of the vast, empty plains of Kansas, of the bitter cold of a winter spent trapping in the mountains, and of the faces of men he had fought beside. He never glorified the violence. He spoke of it with a deep, hollow ache, as one might speak of a disease that had left him permanently scarred, inside and out. Clara, in turn, told him of her childhood home, a place of green trees and gentle rain, a world away from this arid land. She spoke of her love for books she could no longer find and music she no longer heard. Eli was a man of profound restraint. He would sit on his hay bale, she on her crate, a yard of straw-strewn earth between them. This distance was a chasm he seemed determined to maintain, a physical manifestation of the line she could not cross. He was the ranch hand. She was the rancher's wife, but his eyes betrayed him. As she spoke, his gaze would trace the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, with an intensity that made her skin tingle. It was a look of deep, sorrowful wanting, a hunger he fought to keep leashed. And it was this visible battle that gave Clara a strange, heady sense of courage. She began to test the boundaries of that empty space between them. One night, while he spoke of a particularly grueling cattle drive, a wave of exhaustion and emotion washed over her, and she rested her head against his shoulder. He went completely still, his words dying in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed as if bracing for a blow. She could feel the rigid strength of him, the heat of his skin through his thin shirt. She didn't move, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for him to push her away. He never did. After a long, silent moment, she felt a subtle relaxing of the muscles beneath her cheek. He resumed his story, his voice a little rougher than before, and she stayed there, breathing in his scent of leather, sweat, and clean earth. Another evening, as she described a passage from a book she missed, her hands moved with her words, painting pictures in the air. He watched them, fascinated, slowly, as if his arm had a will of its own. He reached out and caught her hand mid-gesture. He didn't hold it, just let his fingers rest against her palm for a moment before letting go. But the touch lingered, a brand of warmth against her skin. Emboldened, the next time he reached for her, she let him. He gently cupped her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin with a reverence that made her want to weep. The unspoken tension between them stretched taut, a string humming with a note that was both beautiful and agonizing. It could not hold forever. One evening, as they sat in their usual places, the silence was different. It was not peaceful. It was heavy with everything they had not yet said or done. Clara looked at his hands, strong and capable, resting on his knees. "If you took my hand," she said, her voice clear and steady in the quiet stable, "I wouldn't let it go." Eli's gaze snapped to hers. He stared at her, his blue eyes a storm of conflict. This was no longer a game of accidental touches and shared glances. This was a choice, a precipice. He seemed to weigh the world in that single moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt as momentous as the turning of the earth, he reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers laced with hers, a firm, possessive grip that sent a shockwave straight to her core. He held her hand tightly, and just as she had promised, she held on. The dam broke on a night thick with the smell of rain. A summer storm had rolled in, muting the world outside in a constant, soothing drumbeat. The moment Clara entered the stable, the air was different. The unspoken question had been answered. The line had been crossed. Eli stood as she approached, and without a word, he closed the small distance between them and pulled her into an embrace. She melted against him, her face buried in the crook of his neck, her arms wrapping around his strong back. It was not a gentle hug. It was a desperate, grounding anchor in a sea of loneliness. He held her as if he were afraid she might dissolve in his arms. After a long moment, he tilted her chin up. He looked into her eyes, a silent question passing between them. And then he lowered his head and kissed her forehead. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a benediction. He kissed her eyelids, her cheeks, and finally, his lips found hers. It was not a soft, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of agonizing, pent-up longing, of shared pain and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It was the taste of rain and salt and want. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other, with trembling fingers. Clara shrugged off the light shawl that covered her shoulders. Her eyes never left his as she reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, over the scars she knew were there. Her palm was flat against the warm, solid muscle, her fingers tracing the raised lines of his past. He flinched, but did not pull away. She moved her other hand to join the first, exploring the geography of his pain with a touch that was not of pity, but of acceptance. This was him. This was the man who had survived, and this was the man she wanted. He shuddered under her touch, his control visibly fraying. He captured her hands, stilling them against his chest. His voice was a raw, ragged whisper, a final, desperate warning. "Clara," he breathed, his eyes boring into hers. "If you don't stop this now, I won't be able to turn back." She looked at this broken, beautiful man, a man who had offered her more kindness in his silence than her husband had in all their shared days. She saw not the scars, but the strength it took to bear them. She felt not fear, but a sense of coming home. "Then don't," she whispered. It was all the permission he needed. He swept her up into his arms and carried her to a clean, soft pile of hay in the corner of the stall. What followed was not a frenzy of passion, but a slow, deliberate, and sacred unwrapping of two souls who had been starved for connection. It was a quiet, explosive discovery, a silent conversation spoken in the language of touch. Every caress was a question, every response a revelation. For Clara, it was the first time she had been touched with reverence, with a hunger that was matched by a deep, abiding tenderness. For Eli, it was an absolution, a chance to feel something other than the ghosts of his past. It was a night filled with the quiet desperation of the lonely, the fierce joy of the found, and the profound solace of finally being seen for who they truly were. Later, they lay tangled together in the warm hay, the rain still drumming a soft lullaby on the stable roof. The lantern cast a gentle golden glow over them. Clara's head was on his chest, her fingers idly tracing the scar that had first drawn her to him. A profound peace had settled over her, a feeling of rightness that defied all logic and law. His arms were wrapped around her, holding her securely, as if he had been made for this very purpose. In the quiet aftermath, There were no words, only the shared rhythm of their breathing. It was in that moment of perfect, fragile peace that the world came crashing down. The main stable door was thrown open with a violent bang that echoed like a gunshot. It slammed against the interior wall, shaking the very timbers of the building. Framed in the dark rectangle of the doorway, silhouetted against the night, stood Abel. He held a lantern high, its light cutting through the dimness, pinning them in its merciless glare. He said nothing. His face was a mask of disbelief, a stunned horror that quickly curdled into something far more terrifying, a cold, absolute, and deadly silent fury. He stood there, a specter of judgment at the gates of their stolen Eden, and in his frozen, wrathful eyes, Clara saw their world and their lives come to an absolute and devastating end. The silence in the stable was a living, breathing monster. It was absolute, broken only by the soft drumming of the rain and Clara's own ragged, panicked breaths. Abel's face, illuminated by the swinging lantern, was a granite mask of cold fury. His eyes were not on Eli, who had moved instinctively to place his body partially in front of Clara's. They were fixed on her, a look of such profound, glacial hatred that it stripped the very air from her lungs. Panic, stark and primal, overwhelmed her. With fumbling, clumsy movements, she scrambled for her shawl and dress, trying to cover herself, to erase the unforgivable reality of what he had seen. The act was futile, a child's attempt to hide from a nightmare. Every rustle of fabric was an indictment. She didn't look at Eli. She couldn't. She could only see her husband, the man who owned her, standing as a silent, terrible judge. When she was finally, inadequately, covered, she stumbled to her feet and ran. She fled from the stable, from the warmth of the hay and the ghost of a shared peace, out into the cold, cleansing rain. She didn't look back. She heard no shout, no curse, no sound of pursuit. Abel simply lowered his lantern and watched her go. He then turned his gaze to Eli, a slow, deliberate look that held more menace than any threat. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a weapon. He just looked at him, and in that look was a promise of utter ruin. Then, Abel turned and walked away, not back toward the house, but out into the stormy darkness of his ranch, leaving them both suspended in a state of pure, undiluted terror. The key turning in her bedroom door was the sound of her world ending. Abel had returned sometime before dawn, his boots heavy on the stairs. He had not come into her room. He had simply locked it from the outside. The first day, she was numb, pacing the floor like a caged animal until exhaustion claimed her. The second day, the hunger began. No one came. The pitcher of water on her nightstand ran dry. By the third day, a profound weakness had set in, her fear giving way to a dizzying despair. Late that afternoon, she heard the key grind in the lock. It was Martha, her face pale and drawn. She carried a tray with a heel of stale bread and a tin cup of water. She set it down without meeting Clara's eyes. "Martha, please!" Clara rasped, her throat dry. "What is he going to do?" The older woman wrung her hands in her apron, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. "He hasn't said much, just that you are to stay here." She hesitated, then seemed to force the words out. "He is deciding, child. He told me he is deciding whether to kill you or to spare you." The words, spoken so plainly, were more terrifying than any threat. It was not a matter of anger, but of cold, pragmatic choice. Her life was an inconvenience to be dealt with. As Martha turned to leave, she pressed a small, crumpled piece of paper into Clara's hand. "The boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was run off the property at sunrise the first morning. He gave me this, told me to get it to you if I could." Martha left, locking the door behind her. Clara's trembling fingers smoothed out the scrap of paper. The handwriting was rough, the pencil strokes heavy, but the words were a burning ember in the freezing darkness of her despair. "I will not let her die here." It was a promise. It was an anchor. She clutched the note as if it were a holy relic, the only proof that the man in the stable, and the connection they had shared, had been real. Abel chose the colder vengeance. On the 5th day, Clara was taken from her room, not by Abel, but by the town sheriff and his deputy. She was weak, disheveled, and utterly humiliated as they led her to a wagon. Abel was already there, dressed in his Sunday best, his face impassive. He had been to redemption and met with his lawyer. He was not seeking blood. He was seeking total annihilation. He had filed a formal complaint with the territorial magistrate, accusing his wife of adultery and demanding that their marriage contract be voided, stripping her of any and all claims to his name or property. The trial, if it could be called such, was held in the town's main hall. The room was packed with the same faces that had watched her with pity and scorn. Now, their expressions were hard, their eyes filled with a grim, self-righteous satisfaction. This is what happens to ungrateful wives. This is the price of sin. The magistrate, a portly man named Judge Miller, who owed Abel more than one favor, sat at a large table at the front of the room. Abel and his lawyer sat to one side. Clara and a court-appointed public defender, a young, terrified man who hadn't looked her in the eye once, sat on the other. The proceedings were a brutal, one-sided affair. Abel's lawyer painted a picture of a kind, respectable older man who had taken in a penniless young woman out of the goodness of his heart, only to be betrayed in the most vile and disgusting manner with a common drifter. The words immorality, deceit, and carnal betrayal were used like stones, thrown at her again and again. Clara sat silent, her head bowed, the crumpled note from Eli clutched in her fist inside her dress pocket. She had no defense. The truth was her crime. When the lawyer had finished, Judge Miller looked at Clara. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, Mrs. Abel?" The title was a mockery. She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump of shame in her throat. "Then this seems quite—" "I would like to say something, Your Honor." The voice, calm and clear, came from the back of the room. A murmur went through the crowd as they turned to see who had spoken. It was Reverend Michael, the town's elderly preacher, a man with a gentle face and eyes that had seen too much of human failing to be easily shocked. He walked slowly to the front of the room. "This is not a church, Reverend," the judge said impatiently. "No, it is not," the Reverend agreed, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Abel. "It is a place of the law, but I wonder if the law is asking the right questions. We have heard a great deal about a broken contract. I ask the court, was there ever a true marriage to begin with? Or was this a transaction? A young woman's life exchanged for the settling of a debt?" Abel's face darkened. The crowd began to whisper uneasily. "We condemn this young woman for seeking comfort in the arms of another," the Reverend continued, his voice gaining strength. "But did anyone here ever see her treated with the comfort and affection of a wife? Did we not see a bird in a cage, as some of you so rightly whispered? We are quick to condemn the sin, but slow to examine the sorrow that breeds it. The law may find her guilty of betrayal, but I fear many of us in this room are guilty of a far greater sin, the sin of indifference." He looked directly at Clara, his eyes holding not condemnation, but a profound, sorrowful compassion. Then he turned and walked slowly back to his seat. A tense silence filled the hall. The Reverend hadn't defended her actions, but he had held up a mirror to the town, and they did not like the reflection. Judge Miller, flustered and eager to regain control, cleared his throat loudly. "While the Reverend's sermon is noted, it has no bearing on the facts of the case. The contract is clear. The betrayal is clear." He banged his gavel on the table. "I find the defendant, Clara, guilty of marital betrayal. The marriage contract is hereby dissolved. She is to be stripped of the name Abel and is entitled to none of his property or protection. She is to be removed from his home immediately. The words washed over Clara. A quiet sob escaped her lips. It was over. She was officially nothing, a branded woman, cast out with only the clothes on her back, as the sheriff gently took her arm to lead her from the hall. She lifted her tear-filled eyes and scanned the crowd one last time. And then she saw him. He was standing in the shadows near the back wall, almost hidden behind a pillar. He was dressed in unfamiliar, rough-spun clothes, a cheap, wide-brimmed hat pulled down low, obscuring his face. But it couldn't hide his eyes. They were the same startling blue, the same deep, weary sadness, now sharpened with a cold, focused fury that was directed not at her, but at the whole room. Their gazes locked for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. It was Eli. He was here. He had not abandoned her. He was watching, waiting. His presence didn't erase the verdict or the shame, but it was a silent promise, a confirmation of the words scrawled on the note in her pocket. I will not let her die here, as she was led out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. A tiny, defiant spark of hope ignited in the ashes of her ruin, while Clara was cast into a social abyss. Eli descended into a literal one. He journeyed 50 miles south to the Granite Creek mining claims, a raw, chaotic gash in the earth where men tore fortunes from the rock with dynamite, sweat, and blood. Life in the camp was brutal and unforgiving. The air was thick with quartz dust that coated the throat and lungs, and the days were a deafening symphony of sledgehammers striking steel, the grinding of ore carts, and the periodic ground-shaking roar of explosives. Eli took to the work with a grim, single-minded ferocity that unnerved the other miners. He wasn't digging for gold. He was forging a weapon. Every swing of the pickaxe was a blow against his own helplessness. Every cart of ore he hauled from the dark. Suffocating tunnels was a penance. He worked double shifts, taking the most dangerous jobs, his body becoming leaner, harder, the muscles standing out like ropes under his sun-scorched skin. He ate the miserable camp food in silence, his thoughts 1,000 miles away in a dusty town with a woman who was paying the price for his moment of tenderness. At night, while other men gambled or drank away their pay, Eli would carefully fold his earnings and hide them in a leather pouch, a growing hoard that was both his hope and his obsession. He was not just earning a living. He was proving, to himself more than anyone, that he was a man who could provide, who could protect, who could build something instead of just surviving what was torn down. But his mission was twofold. A mining camp was a crossroads of broken men and forgotten histories. Over campfires and cheap whiskey, tongues were loosened. Eli became a patient listener, a silent shadow absorbing the stories that floated in the smoky air. He was searching for a name, Abel. He asked quiet, careful questions. Mentioning he'd worked on his ranch, one night, an old, grizzled prospector with a hacking cough recognized the name. Abel, the righteous rancher, the old man sneered. Knew him during the war, back when he was quartermaster's clerk. Man had a gift for making inventory disappear. Sold army blankets and hardtack to settlers for a premium, while the boys at the front were freezing and starving. Had a partner in it, a fella named Silas Croft. The prospector spat into the fire. Silas got greedy, threatened to talk, ended up with a bullet in his back on a lonely road. Ruled an accident, of course. Abel was always good at making his tracks vanish. The story was a key. Eli used a portion of his saved wages to travel to the territorial capital. He spent days in the dusty archives, poring over old military supply logs and land deeds. He found discrepancies, ledgers with pages neatly cut out, and land grants awarded to Abel under suspicious circumstances immediately after the war, land that had belonged to Mexican families for generations. He found Silas Croft's death certificate. Then he found Silas Croft's brother, a bitter, fearful man running a smithy in a town 2 days' ride away. After hours of patient persuasion and the promise of protection, the blacksmith finally broke his long silence, producing a small, locked box containing his brother's journal, a detailed account of their illicit dealings with Abel, ending with a fearful entry about their final, fatal meeting. Eli had his proof. Meanwhile, Clara was living in a state of suspended animation. She had been given a small, dilapidated shack at the very edge of redemption, a place usually reserved for widows with no family and women of ill repute. Its roof leaked. A cold wind whistled through the gaps in the wallboards, and the door didn't lock properly. The town treated her like a leper. Women would cross the street to avoid her path, their faces masks of pious disdain. The storekeeper sold her goods but would leave her change on the counter, refusing to let their hands touch. No one would offer her work. She survived on the few coins she had in her pockets and the secret charity of Martha, who would sometimes leave a small bundle of bread and salted meat near the town well late at night. Clara's days were long and empty. Her nights were long and cold. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a town that had already condemned and buried her. One night, as a cold wind rattled the loose pane of glass in her window, there was a soft knock on her door. Fear, sharp and cold, seized her. It could be anyone, a drunk, a tormentor. She huddled in her thin blanket, her heart pounding. The knock came again, quiet but insistent. "Clara." The voice was a low whisper, but it was as clear as a bell. It was his voice, unbelieving. She stumbled to the door and fumbled with the latch. She pulled it open, and there he was. Eli stood in the moonlight, looking thinner, harder, but his eyes held the same intense fire she remembered. In one hand, he held a heavy leather pouch, and in the other, a sheaf of oilskin-wrapped papers. The sight of him, real and solid before her, broke the dam of her carefully constructed composure. A sob tore from her throat, and she launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, her tears soaking his rough spun shirt. He held her tightly, his arms a circle of strength and safety, one hand stroking her matted hair. They didn't speak. There were no words for the months of fear, loneliness, and hard-bitten hope. There was only the silent, desperate comfort of their embrace, two lost souls finding their anchor in the cold, indifferent night. He gently led her inside, closing the flimsy door against the wind. He lit her small lamp and looked around the miserable shack, his jaw tightening in a grim line. He placed the heavy pouch on the rickety table. It landed with a solid, metallic thud. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But it's enough. Enough to get us away from here. We can go to Oregon or California, start over where no one knows our names." He then placed the oilskin packet beside the gold. "Or," he said, his blue eyes locking with hers, "we can stay. This," he tapped the papers, "is the truth about Abel. His whole life is built on lies and stolen money. We can use it. We can take him to court and demand justice." He took her hands in his grip firm and steady. "The choice is yours. Clara, we can run and be free, or we can stand and fight to reclaim everything." Clara looked from the gold to the papers, and then back to Eli's earnest, searching face. Months ago, she would have taken the gold and run without a second thought, desperate for any escape. But the girl who had been sold into marriage was gone. In her place was a woman who had been caged, shamed, and cast out. A woman who had been pushed to the very edge of her existence and had not broken. She had been stripped of everything but her own spirit, and she found, to her own surprise, that it was forged of something stronger than she had ever imagined. She closed her fingers around his. A quiet, fierce strength filled her. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. A slow smile spread across Eli's face, a rare and beautiful sight that seemed to light up the dim little room. "I know," he said. "Let's go get your life back." They returned to the town hall not as defendants, but as plaintiffs. They hired the young public defender who had represented Clara before, this time armed with evidence and a righteous cause. The young lawyer's fear was replaced with a fiery determination. The news that the disgraced wife was suing the powerful Abel sent a shockwave through the town. The hall was even more packed than before. But this time the atmosphere was not one of smug judgment, but of breathless, incredulous curiosity. When Eli was called to the stand, a hush fell over the room. He was no longer the silent, scarred ranch hand. He stood tall and spoke with a calm, unwavering authority. He told the story of Silas Croft, producing the man's journal. He presented the forged military ledgers and the fraudulent land deeds. With each piece of evidence, Abel's face grew paler, his composure crumbling until it was replaced by a sputtering, red-faced rage. He shouted denials, calling Eli a liar, a drifter, a thief. But the evidence was undeniable. The blacksmith, Silas's brother, testified. An old army clerk, tracked down by Eli, confirmed the forgeries. Abel's entire life, his reputation for being a hard but honest man, was dismantled piece by piece before the very town that had respected him. He visibly sagged in his chair, a powerful man reduced to a ruined, pathetic shell. The magistrate, faced with irrefutable proof, had no choice. Abel was found guilty of fraud and conspiracy. His assets were seized by the territorial court, and a significant portion was awarded to Clara as restitution for a marriage entered into under fraudulent pretenses, a contract built on a foundation of stolen wealth. As the verdict was read, the crowd didn't cheer. They sat in stunned silence, their gazes shifting from the broken form of Abel to the slight, determined figure of the young woman beside her lawyer. They had witnessed something they had never seen before. A woman, cast out and condemned, who had refused to be a victim. She had stood up to the most powerful man they knew and, with the help of a scarred and silent stranger, had pulled his entire world down around him. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thing to behold, and in that moment, Clara was no longer a pariah. She was a legend. Clara did not use her settlement to purchase a grand house in town or to acquire a portion of Abel's forfeited ranch. To the town's collective surprise, she took only a small fraction of the money and bought a 10-acre plot of land from the territorial office. It was a parcel no one else had wanted, considered too wild and undeveloped, but Clara knew its secret. It was the piece of land through which the small, willow-choked creek flowed, the very creek where she had watched Eli bathe, the very spot where they had first spoken, the ground that had borne witness to their first kiss. It was not a piece of property. It was a testament. They started with nothing but the land, the small pouch of gold Eli had earned, and a shared, unspoken determination. The first thing they built was not a house, but a home. Eli, with his ingrained knowledge of the wilderness, showed her how to choose the straightest, strongest pines. The sound of his axe echoed in the little valley, a clean, sharp report that was the sound of a new life being carved from the old. Clara worked beside him, stripping bark, hauling smaller logs, her hands growing calloused and strong. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their shared labor a silent conversation, a physical rebuilding that mirrored their internal mending. The cabin they erected was small and simple, with one main room and a sleeping loft. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke and clean earth. It was more a home than the grand, joyless house on the ranch had ever been. Clara planted a garden, her fingers sinking into the rich, dark soil near the creek bed. She coaxed rows of beans, squash, and corn from the earth, taking a fierce, primal pride in every green shoot that broke the surface. They acquired a half-dozen chickens that scratched and clucked in the yard, providing a daily, comforting rhythm to their lives. Their days were filled with the simple, exhaustive tasks of survival, but it was a joyful exhaustion. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of their new cabin, watching the sun set behind the stony hills. Sometimes they talked for hours. Other times they sat in a comfortable silence, her head resting on his shoulder, his hand holding hers. In these moments, a fragile, beautiful peace would settle over Clara. She had found it, a life that was truly her own, shared with a man who saw her, who had fought for her. But as the weeks turned into months, she began to notice the shadows that still clung to Eli. He was a kind and attentive partner, his actions always speaking of a deep, protective love for her. But there were moments when he would fall silent, his eyes taking on that familiar, haunted look, his gaze fixed on a past she could not see. He would be mending a fence or sharpening an axe, and a stillness would come over him, as if he were listening to a distant echo. He never spoke of these moments, and she learned not to press him, sensing the wounds were still too raw to bear the light. The nights were the worst. Sometimes he would cry out in his sleep, his hands clenched, his body rigid with some unseen battle. He would awake with a gasp, his skin slick with sweat, the terror of his dreams still clinging to him. She would hold him, murmuring soft words of comfort, until the frantic beating of his heart slowed and he would fall back into a restless sleep. He was haunted by the war, but it was more than that. He was haunted by his own survival, and he carried a deep-seated fear that the peace he had found with her was something he had not earned, something that would be snatched away. He loved her with a ferocity that frightened her sometimes, because it was the love of a man who did not believe he was worthy of what he held. One night, the fear came to a head. It had been a particularly good day. They had worked together in the garden, their laughter echoing in the clear air. That evening, he had held her with a particular tenderness, a desperate quality to his embrace. Clara fell asleep feeling cherished and safe, a profound contentment settling deep in her bones. She awoke sometime after midnight to a sudden chill. The space beside her in the bed was empty. The cabin was silent, save for the chirping of crickets outside. A flicker of unease turned into a cold dread. She lit a lamp and searched the small cabin. He was gone. His boots were missing, as was the worn gun belt he always kept on a peg by the door. Panic, stark and suffocating, seized her. But this was a different fear from the one she had felt locked in Abel's house. It was not for herself, but for him. She knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that he hadn't just left, he had fled, not from her, but from himself. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling. She took the lamp and went outside. In the soft, damp earth near the creek, she found his footprints. They were heading away from their home, north, in the direction of the town cemetery. Her heart constricted. She knew what she had to do. She began to follow the trail, her small lantern a lonely beacon in the vast, moonlit darkness. The cemetery was a bleak, silent place on a low hill overlooking the town. Leaning headstones stood like crooked teeth against the starry sky. She found him in the oldest section, a place of simple wooden markers and unmarked graves. He was sitting on the ground, his back against a small, weathered wooden cross that he must have carved himself years ago. His hat was on the ground beside him, and he was staring at a small, tattered photograph held in both hands. It was the grave of his sister, Sarah. Clara approached slowly, her footsteps making no sound on the soft grass. He didn't seem to hear her. He was lost, adrift in a sea of grief so profound it was a tangible presence. She could feel the waves of it radiating from him in the cold night air. She did not speak his name, did not rush to comfort him. Instead, she simply came and sat beside him on the cool earth, her shoulder lightly touching his. For a long time, they sat in silence, two small figures in a city of the dead. He did not acknowledge her, but he didn't pull away. Finally, she looked at the faded image in his hands. It was a formal portrait of a solemn-faced young boy with startling blue eyes, his arm wrapped protectively around a small, smiling girl with a mass of dark curls. It was Eli and Sarah, before the war, before the hunger, before the world had carved its brutal story onto his skin. Then, Clara did the only thing she could think to do. She reached out her hand, not to take the photograph, not to wipe a tear from his cheek, but to touch the place where they had begun. She laid her palm flat against his chest, her fingers finding the familiar, raised line of the long scar beneath his shirt. It was the same gesture from that first night in the stable, a touch that said, "I see you, all of you, and I am not afraid." A great, shuddering tremor went through his body. The photograph fell from his limp fingers. He turned his head away from her, but she could see the violent shaking of his shoulders. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sob of a pain held for too long, and then he broke. The man of iron and scars, the silent survivor, finally wept. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, and cried with the unrestrained grief of a boy who had lost everything and a man who was terrified of losing it all again. Clara wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as the storm of his sorrow washed over them both. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply held him, her presence a silent anchor until the terrible, racking sobs subsided into quiet. Exhausted shudders. He finally lifted his head, his face streaked with tears in the moonlight. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, his voice broken. "You, this home, after everything I've done, after what I couldn't do for her." Clara gently took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her own eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was steady and strong, filled with a certainty that was absolute. "Eli," she said softly, "I don't need a perfect man. I don't need a man without scars or ghosts." She leaned forward and kissed his tear-stained cheek. "I need the man who survived, the man who came back for me, the man who didn't leave me to die." His eyes searched hers, desperate for the truth in her words. He found it. He saw not a savior, not a saint, but a woman as scarred as he was, offering not a cure, but a shared healing. He leaned into her, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time, he let the full weight of his past be held by another. They stayed there until the first pale fingers of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, chasing away the long shadows. When they finally rose, Eli carefully picked up the photograph and tucked it inside his shirt, placing it over his heart. He reached for Clara's hand, his fingers lacing with hers. They walked back down the hill, away from the graves and toward the rising sun. Their linked hands a silent promise. They were two broken souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. And as they walked, the light grew stronger, illuminating the path ahead. A year passed. The land, once a symbol of desolation and imprisonment, became a canvas for their new life. The small pine cabin no longer smelled new. It smelled of home, of baking bread, of wood smoke, of the dried herbs Clara hung from the rafters. The garden, her small patch of defiance, had thrived under her care, yielding a bounty that saw them through the long, cold winter. And Eli, with the patient, methodical strength that defined him, had built a fence. It was not a fence to keep the world out, but one to mark the boundaries of their sanctuary, its posts marching steadily across their 10 acres, a testament to permanence and protection. The change was not just in the land, but in them. The haunted look in Eli's eyes had been replaced by a deep, quiet calm. He still bore his scars, but they no longer seemed to define him. They were simply a part of the man who now spent his days working his own land, his face peaceful and content. He was building another room onto the side of the cabin, a small nursery, and the steady, rhythmic sound of his hammer was the heartbeat of their future. For a year after the trial, Clara was with child, a gentle, growing swell in her belly that was a promise of a life created not from debt and duty, but from a love that had bloomed in the darkest of places. The town of redemption, true to its name, began its own slow, awkward journey toward atonement. It started subtly. One morning, Clara found a bottle of fresh milk on their porch step, with no note to say where it had come from. A week later, a warm loaf of sourdough bread, wrapped in a clean dishcloth, appeared. Then a jar of peach preserves, a small sack of potatoes, a beautifully stitched baby quilt. These were the town's silent apologies, their wordless confessions of shame. They could not take back their judgment, but they could offer these small, anonymous tokens of peace. Clara would accept them with a quiet smile, understanding that this was the only way they knew how to say they were sorry, the only way they could welcome the outcasts back into the fold. One Sunday afternoon, they had a visitor. Reverend Michael rode up to their cabin, his old horse moving at a gentle pace. He dismounted, his kind eyes taking in the sturdy cabin, the flourishing garden, the new room taking shape. Eli and Clara greeted him on the porch, and she offered him a cool drink of water from their well. "I confess," the Reverend said, a gentle smile on his face, "I have been watching your progress from a distance. It is quite remarkable." He looked from the cabin to the creek, and then at the two of them, standing together, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "You know," he said, leaning on the porch rail, "they have a name for this place in town now. The gossips and the pious alike. They all call it the same thing."
"What is that, Reverend?"
Clara asked softly. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing warmth. "They call it the House of the Free." He let the words settle in the quiet air. "I think it is because they see that you are not just free from Abel or from the past. You are free to be, and that is a powerful thing to witness, a terrifying thing for some, but a hopeful one for most." That evening, a cool breeze whispered through the open cabin window. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the room. Clara sat in a rocking chair Eli had made for her, a book the Reverend had brought as a gift resting in her lap. She wasn't reading, merely watching the flames, one hand resting protectively on her stomach, feeling the faint, fluttering movements within. Eli came in from outside, smelling of the cool night air and sawdust. He moved quietly behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, gently kneading the tired muscles there. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her hair, and then her temple. For a long moment, they stayed like that, watching the fire together in a comfortable, easy silence. "I still remember it," he whispered, his voice a low, soft rumble against her ear. "The first touch, in the dark, in the stable. Your hand." Clara stopped rocking. She leaned her head back against his chest, her eyes closing as she recalled the moment. The fear, the trembling, the raw, desperate need for connection. She could feel the ghost of it even now, the memory of his warm skin, the raised line of the scar beneath her fingertips. She smiled, a slow, gentle curve of her lips. "I touched a scar," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "But I had no idea it was the door." She turned her head to look up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I didn't know it was the door that would lead me to love." He bent down and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was full of the quiet history they shared. It held the memory of the rain on the stable roof, the taste of tears in the cold moonlight of the cemetery, and the warmth of 1,000 sunrises shared over their own piece of land. When he pulled away, he took her hand and led her to the window. They stood side by side, looking out into the night. The moon was high, casting a silver light over the harsh, beautiful country. The same rocky hills that had once seemed like prison walls now stood as silent, protective sentinels around their home. The wind that had once sounded so mournful now whispered through the pines like a lullaby. The land had not changed. It was still a place of extremes, of struggle and survival. But their love had given them a new sky to put over it. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands cradling her belly, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood there, two scarred survivors, looking out at the world that had tried to break them, the wounds, the memories, the shame, and the judgment. They were all still there, woven into the fabric of who they were. But they were no longer chains. They were the foundation stones of the life they had built, the shared history that bound them, the proof that even in the most desolate of lands, on the most barren of ground, love could find a way to take root and, against all odds, bloom. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Campfire, and share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.